The leaders of Russia and Japan enter talks to finally end hostilities from World War II. But could disputed land upend the diplomacy and spark a political storm from Putin's own people? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is the Kuril Islands. Vladimir Putin doesn't enjoy the popularity he once had in Russia compared to when his forces annexed Crimea from Ukraine. A new state poll says only 33% of Russians trust him. And with political capital running low, has Putin tried to make another land grab? No, instead, he may be giving territory away. And some of his countrymen are not happy about it. See, Putin has been meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to broker a peace deal harkening back to World War II. And on the table are the disputed Kuril Islands. There's talk that Putin may hand over two of them to Japan. It could end long-held hostilities and promote economic cooperation. It may also coax the Japanese into easing sanctions against Moscow for the war in Ukraine. The only problem? Monarchists and communists are joining in protest to say Russian land is not for sale. So, what's Putin's next move? Randolph Nogel reports.
A chain of islands that stretches between Japan and Russia contains the weakest links in their diplomatic ties. In all, there are 56 Kuril Islands, but it's the southernmost four at issue, controlled by Russia and contested by Japan. Before World War II, 17,000 Japanese people lived on them. Now, those old enough to remember those days can only see their former home from afar. Russia captured the islands in the final days of the war. Moscow says the US president at the time, Franklin D. Roosevelt, told Soviet leader Joseph Stalin that he could take the Kurils in exchange for joining the war against Japan. The promise was allegedly made at the Yalta Conference in 1945. It was there the victorious Allied leaders divvied up the post-war world. But due to deep roots of national heritage, the islands remain an emotional issue in Japan, where they're still called the Northern Territories. And they remain the reason why, decades after the end of the Second World War, Japan and Russia still haven't signed a peace treaty.
Это не предварительные требования, это просто стремление понять, почему Япония единственная страна в мире, которая не может сказать «я признаю итоги Второй мировой войны в полном объеме». Это на самом деле так.
Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and Russian President Vladimir Putin have met in Moscow, their 25th meeting in 5 years, to discuss the dispute.
Мы, Россия, Родиной не торгуем! Курилы, русская земля! Курилы, русская земля!
But there's strong public pushback in Russia to ceding any territory. Russian politicians have called for a guarantee that Japan wouldn't allow US missile facilities on the Kurils before any deal can be made, even as Russia has fortified the islands and held military drills. And while a peace treaty would be welcomed by Russia and Japan, neither appears willing to give ground on their national interests, which may mean that no ground is given at all. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Tokyo is political science professor James Brown, who teaches out of Temple University. He's also the author of Japan, Russia and Their Territorial Dispute. Also in Tokyo is Tamerlan Abdekiev. He's the founder of the global strategy consulting company Invero Advisors. And finally, an associate professor at Moscow State University of International Relations, Anna Kirieva. I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Anna, let me start with you. Why is this so important to Russia?
This is the issue of sovereignty and the results of the Second World War for the Russian Federation. If we take into consideration that there was a decision in Yalta among the allies that these islands could be taken by the Soviet Union in order for the Soviet Union to join the war with Japan. And we could understand that these are the islands that, from the Russian perspective, have been the acquisition has been the result of the Second World War, and it is connected with these results. That's why it is the issue of sovereignty, of pride. And apart from that, if we take into consideration the 4 islands, there are also strategic considerations and military considerations, as well as economic ones with fishing and exclusive economic zone. But of course, probably the military and strategic considerations are the most important here.
Yeah, talking about the strategic value. So James Brown, I remember there was an analysis, a glib one, of the Falklands dispute saying it was 2 bald men arguing over a comb. Now, with this one, is it just like that, or is it of major strategic value to both sides?
I don't think it's of major strategic value to both sides. From the Russian point of view, it does have significant military value because the Sea of Okhotsk is very important to the Russian military. For Japan, however, the issue here is not really strategic. It rather is to do with historical memory and the Japanese view of the end of the Second World War. So Anna was mentioning that this is all really about different interpretations of World War II, and that's certainly the case from the Japanese point of view. Japanese citizens grow up learning that these islands were seized from Japan unjustly at the end of the Second World War, that the Soviet Union broke a neutrality pact with Japan and seized the islands after the end of Japan's declaration of its intention to surrender. So you have a very, very different view within Japan about this dispute from what you hear on the Russian side. Right,
of course, and everybody has different parameters when it comes to, you know, when it started. So 1786, 1855, 1875, 1905, 1945. But James, at the heart of it all, if Shinzo Abe doesn't get it back, it's not as if his government's going to collapse, right?
Yeah, that's right. I think the Japanese public is actually reasonably well informed about this issue and have realistic expectations. There was a survey that was very recently published which indicated that more than 70% of Japanese do not really believe that significant progress is going to be made on this issue. So whilst the Prime Minister himself is determined to achieve a breakthrough here, it seems that the Japanese public have kind of more important concerns, above all the economy.
Tamerlan Abdikiev, if Putin decides, okay, Japan, you get the 4 islands back, is that going to harm him terribly domestically?
Well, I think he apparently runs some risks. Actually, both sides do. Prime Minister Abe also takes certain political risk going this path, especially trying to figure out some sort of deal, 2 islands or 2 plus alpha. There are a few options now on the table, I believe. As for President Putin, of course, public opinion is very important in order to make any move towards settlement with territories. But on the other hand, President Putin still maintains rather high level of support internally. So if he really decides to do that, I believe he can make it happen.
Let's have a little listen to a protest at a rally who was not happy at the very prospect that Russia would give up 1 or more even of those islands. Have a little listen.
It is difficult for me to imagine that the US would negotiate with someone on the basis of some kind of peace treaty 70 years ago and discuss the slightest potential transfer of their territories. This is nonsense. This is unthinkable.
So, Anna, at the heart of it all, are ordinary Russians thinking nobody says the US must give up large parts of its south back to Mexico? This is our land and we're going to keep it our land. Are they angry at the very prospect that there's talks with the Japanese over this?
Well, I should point out that there is a difference if we speak about 4 islands or 2 islands. I guess transferring 4 islands is out of the question anyway. Russia's position has been consistent with the Soviet-Japanese declaration of 1956 that says that there may be transfer of only 2 islands, which are 2 smaller islands of Shikotan and Habomai, to Japan after the signing of the peace treaty as an act of goodwill. So it will now, if we look at the polls, about 74% of Russian population are against or do not support, at least, the transfer of any islands. Of course, not speaking about the 4. Even the transfer of 2 islands will be very difficult for President Putin to explain to the Russian population, despite his popularity. However, here we have the issue of the international treaty, because the Soviet-Japanese declaration has been, it was ratified by the 2 governments and their parliaments during Soviet period in Russia. And President Putin has repeatedly stated that he adheres to this declaration. So if the Russian government sticks to this position, if we speak only about 2 islands, only 3,000 people live there. It's not that much. So this could be one of the, well, more probable options. I think that 4 islands they are out of the question for the Russian side forever.
Yeah, and it's a good point to make that not all of the islands are the same, and there's some wiggle room when it comes to give and take there. James, one of the big issues for the Russians seems to be that if Japan gets 1 or 2 or more of these islands back, Tokyo might allow the United States to build military installations there. Is that ever likely?
Well, it's a concern that has been expressed on the Russian side on several occasions. And now Prime Minister Abe has sought to alleviate those concerns. In December, he is reported to have given a promise that he would not permit US facilities to be located there. That probably wouldn't be good enough, however, for the Russian side. They believe that they were given similar promises at the end of the Cold War, that NATO would not be expanded, and of course it was. Also, they are aware that Prime Minister Abe will not be Prime Minister forever. There will be other leaders. Perhaps they would take a different view. And added to that, the Russian side is very aware that the US has a large amount of leverage over Japan, meaning that irrespective of the intentions of the Japanese leadership, it could well be used, that leverage is used to change the views, change the decision of the Japanese leadership. So I think that what the Russians would want would be an actual concrete and legally binding commitment from Japan that no US bases could be allowed there. And the way that that could occur would be that the islands would be excluded from the US-Japan Security Treaty, which gives the US basing rights.
Tamerlane, is this friction and these negotiations and the gaps that we still see between the 2 sides, is that an opportunity for the US to wiggle itself into it?
What James just mentioned, there is a lot of leverage that US has over Japan. And apparently what I see here, being in Tokyo, based here in Tokyo, is Japanese business, Japanese politicians are still very much under, I wouldn't say control, but they are very much driven by US politics and US presence as per se. So in this sense, of course, Russia has to be very careful in terms of securing all possible points where US can interfere in future, especially with military presence and so on.
Yeah.
And I believe this is being a very big and important point for negotiations.
Yes.
I think that good signs are that Japan is now really started considering Russian concerns over national security, where in the past it wasn't even negotiated. But now military presence, state of Sea of Okhotsk, presence of Russian bases on those islands. These all topics are finally being negotiated and discussed.
Anna, the fact that these islands have prevented the signing of a formal peace, of course, the 2 countries haven't been at war for a long, long time, but they're still technically at war because they haven't formally made peace. For those who look at it and think, oh my God, Russia and Japan are arguing over these islands still, and there's a dispute, we might see something flare up. Is that completely way out and impossible?
Well, technically, the 2 countries have not been at the state of war since 1956, the Japanese-Soviet declaration that actually terminates the state of war. But this is really kind of abnormal situation. No war, but no peace. if we look at what we may see in future, I would say that reaching a peace treaty would be very difficult. I wouldn't say that it is impossible, but it is going to be difficult. And now we can see that Japan has apparently changed its position. Probably, well, one of the scenarios could be signing of the peace treaty and transfer of the lesser two islands if this issue, the military issue, is solved or can be at least solved or addressed. And then there should also be some kind of economic cooperation on the other two islands, these 2+alpha, because the Japanese Prime Minister should also have some incentive how to explain it to the Japanese population. And apart from that, what Russian president and foreign minister both have mentioned repeatedly, that we do need a new positive atmosphere of cooperation between the countries in order to solve this issue. So we need to build up economic investment links and, well, political cooperation, and probably even improve security cooperation in order for even this scenario to materialize.
James Brown, good fences make good neighbors. You had a dispute with your neighbor. You didn't hug it out, but nobody's oppressing anyone and nobody's dying. So do they actually need a peace deal, or should it just be business as usual? Why the push for a formal peace?
Well, it's a very good point that the agreement in 1956 is described as a joint declaration, but really it goes 90% of the way towards a peace treaty, that there is no way that these two countries in the short term are going to go to war with each other. That is just about unthinkable. And so you could make the case that a peace treaty is simply unnecessary. The main issue, of course, is the territorial issue. It would be very easy to sign a peace treaty if it were not for that. Russia is ready to sign a peace treaty. That was reiterated by President Putin in September. It's the Japanese side that refuses to do so because they say that they will not do so until the territorial issue has been resolved. However, it is, of course, very hard to make progress on that. It all comes down to incentives. And at the moment, it seems that there's a lack of incentives for Russia to transfer this territory.
Do you agree with that, Tamerlane? Lack of incentives for Russia to do anything about it, do anything about the status quo?
Probably on the surface, I would agree. But if you dig a bit deeper and consider and see the whole picture in the region, I think Russia has very difficult neighbor and large neighbor, China. And actually, on the surface, relationship with China is declared to be best in history and so on and so forth. But it's not really the case. And Russia, in the longer run, has to balance out somehow Chinese presence and Chinese presence in the region and in Russia also, because Chinese business and Chinese people are very actively now penetrating the Far East region of Russia, and only 5 million Russian citizens in that region. So in the longer run, to develop that region and to make it attractive for its own citizens, Russia has to solve a lot of issues in terms of building infrastructure, creating some jobs, and building good businesses. So in that sense, Russia has to think how to balance out this geopolitically and economically, the development of the Far East. And in that sense, Japan is, of course, being a very large economy, is a natural choice.
Well, the Russians call it the Kurils, and the Japanese call them the Northern Territories. So far, it's not been sorted out, and it's going to be interesting to hear what comes out of that meeting between the two sides. For the moment, I have to move on. Anna, James, and Tamerlane, thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, China and Canada are locked in a diplomatic dispute. Are innocent people being jailed in a game of political chess? And can a company known for shaving razors sell feminism to men? We debate why some think Gillette overstepped with their new ad. The fate of several people's lives are in limbo over a dispute between China and Canada. At issue is the arrest of Chinese tech executive Meng Wanzhou, who's suspected of defrauding U.S. banks. Her detention and possible extradition are causing a fury among Chinese leaders, and some claim they're taking it out on other Canadians. China has arrested 2 Canadians, a diplomat and one in the tourism industry, on what the government says is national security issues. And then a 3rd Canadian, who's already serving a prison sentence in China, was retried and sentenced to death. Are these prisoners pawns in a bigger diplomatic game? Haider Abbasi reports.
The defendant, Robert Lloyd Schellenberg, has committed the crime of smuggling drugs. Therefore, the court rules that the defendant is sentenced to death.
This is the 2nd time China has sentenced Canadian national Robert Schellenberg. Back in November, he received a prison sentence on the same charges. So why was he retried? Analysts say it's because Beijing is retaliating against the arrest in Canada of this woman, Meng Wanzhou. Meng is the chief financial officer of the technology giant Huawei. She was arrested in December at the request of the US, which wants to extradite her for allegedly violating sanctions against Iran. Canada's Prime Minister has denounced the death sentence for Schellenberg.
But I will say it is of extreme concern to us as a government, as it should be to all our international friends and allies, that China has chosen to begin to arbitrarily apply death penalty in cases facing, as in this case, facing a Canadian.
And the Chinese hit back with this.
We urge the Canadian side to respect the rule of law, respect China's legal sovereignty, correct its mistakes, and stop making irresponsible remarks.
Since Meng's arrest, Beijing has arrested several Canadians based in China. Most have now been released. But has Canada been caught up in a dispute that's really between Beijing and Washington? China considers Meng's arrest to be not about crime, but politics. That's because in September, Washington slapped tariffs on Chinese goods worth $200 billion, saying it was in response to unfair trading practices by Beijing. Then, 3 months later, Trump said he would intervene in Meng's case if it would help the US to reach a trade deal with China. China also believes the US is trying to undermine its technology industry. Last year, the US banned Huawei products from being used by government agencies. It said it's concerned the Chinese government is using the technology for espionage. Then Australia and New Zealand did the same, but not Canada. Washington has until the end of the month to request Meng's extradition. This coincides with more trade negotiations between the US and China. So what will happen to Canada-China relations if Meng is extradited to the US? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now is Lynette Ong. She's a professor of political science at the University of Toronto. In Beijing, we have Victor Gao. He's the director of the China National Association of International Studies. And in Washington, D.C. is Sophie Richardson. She's the China Director for Human Rights Watch. I thank you all for joining us here on The Newsmakers. Lynette, let me start with you. This Canada-China spat, it looks and feels like a hostage ransom situation in many ways. Is it?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Yes, it does look like a hostage diplomacy. What China has been doing is detaining Canadians, 2 Canadians in the hands of the Chinese authorities, what looks like tit-for-tat strategy for Canada's arrest of Meng Wanzhou, who is the CFO of Huawei, the flagship technology companies from China. The backdrop is really the technology war going on between US and China, and Canada is just assisting the United States detaining Meng Wanzhou on the request of the US authorities.
Victor Gao, is this what China is doing with Robert Schellenberg, for example, his death penalty, nothing to do with drug smuggling and all about sending a message to the Canadians?
First of all, China-Canadians have very good relations for decades. And this recent round of deterioration of relations between China and Canada is not triggered by China. It's simply triggered by Canada itself. And I hope Canada will have a chance to reflect and come up with a solution as quickly as possible. Now, I think the Chinese government has already made the point very clear. There is no connection between Meng Wanzhou's case and the arrest of several Canadians in China, as well as the death sentence passed out to Mr. Schellenberg. I think this is absolutely correct because these cases are very, very different. However, philosophically speaking, everything in the world is interconnected with each other. If anyone believes that there is no connection at all, philosophically speaking, I think he or she is indulging in his or her fantasy. There must be some connection, even though there is no legal connection. And I think the Canadian government really need to wake up to the reality that they need to deal with the Meng Wanzhou case very properly, rather than really
let me take you up on that. Let me put on my philosophical hat and take you up on that. So philosophically speaking, if it's interconnected and it is a response, then is it justified?
Whether it is justified or not, that's a completely another level of questions. I think the recent deterioration of relations between China and Canada is triggered by Canada, and it needs to be solved by Canada. Otherwise, the relations will be more and more poisoned, and both China and Canada will be victims of the deterioration of the relations between China and Canada. We cannot afford that. We need to restore the relations back to normalcy.
Okay, so Sophie Richardson, we have on the one hand a technology company and the Canadians having concerns about how they do business and whether they might be overreaching and so on. We don't know exactly, the concerns from the Americans and the Canadians. And on the other hand, you have human rights issues. Philosophically, they're connected, according to Victor Gao. Who's in the wrong here? Is it China, Sophie?
Well, I think, we're not dealing in the realm of philosophy. We're dealing in the realm of fact and of law. And I think the fact that Mr. Schellenberg was retried, something like fewer than 2% of all criminal cases in China are ever retried, when it was without providing credible evidence and in the face of significant, although common, violations of fair trial rights in China, that he was held for as long as he was without being charged, that he was denied access to family and lawyers. I think when you line all of that up, there's nothing philosophical about it. It's a very politically motivated prosecution.
Right. And so we have the Huawei chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, arrested, as we mentioned. That was in Vancouver Airport. Now, Lynette Ong, China has threatened repercussions on Canada if Huawei 5G is banned. Tell me what that means to the Canadians. How is that being received by the Canadians, that threat?
It hasn't been received well because I think whether or not a country has decided to go with any technology should be an independent decision made by the country, considering all sorts of facts. I think the fact of the matter is that Canada is really caught in between a rock and a hard place. So let's reverse 7 weeks ago. Trudeau administration, in contrast with the predecessors, has actually been very gung-ho about building strong relationship with China, right? And then, and we are one of the very few countries who actually hasn't denounced Huawei's 5G technology. So all along, we have been friends of China, and the request of Meng Wanzhou was very much at the request of the arrest of Meng Wanzhou was at the request of U.S. authorities. Right. It wasn't at our own initiative. So we are so our hands are actually very, very tight. There's nothing much that we can do to get out of this situation.
Victor Gao, when Ambassador Liu Shay said there will be repercussions, it's Canada's business, right? They can decide what technology they want to use. If they don't want to use the Huawei 5G, why should China try to punish them for it? What are they going to do? Arrest more Canadian citizens and throw them in jail?
Now, first of all, I think it's completely a decision for Canada to make as to what kind of 5G technologies it wants to use, either Huawei or by another company. That should be a commercial decision. If it is a political decision, that's a pity, and I hope the Canadians will be sane enough and wise enough to separate the commercial decision from a political decision. The United States is very much making a political decision on Huawei, and I hope it will not influence the Canadian decision. If, for example, by the end of the day, if the Canadian side decides not to Huawei, I would say the loss is on the Canadians, because whatever they do for the 5G technology, the backbone and the related applications will come along at a higher price, probably lower quality, lower efficiency, and the consumers in Canada will suffer as a consequence. So be my guest if they decide not to use Huawei or use Huawei. And I don't think anyone in China should be agitated about that. We just hope the Canadians will be wise and commercial rather than political, don't become an accomplice of a very eerie behaving United States government.
Sophie Richardson, going back to the trial of Schellenberg, it's interesting that reporters were invited to observe the trial. What do you think was behind that? What's the message being sent by the Chinese?
I think it's an attempt to create the illusion of transparency where it really hasn't existed from the beginning. And so I think it does very little to stave off concerns about whether he's actually had a fair trial.
Victor Gao, the illusion of transparency.
No, I don't think so. First of all, I hope no one in the world, in any country, including Canada or in the United States, should be a defender for Mr. Schellenberg. He is convicted of trying to smuggle more than 200 kilograms of drugs from China to, among all countries, Australia. This is really a heinous crime. And I think China is a sovereign country. China has its own legal system, and the court worked and passed on a death sentence to Mr. Schellenberg. I think all the countries in the world, including Canada, should respect the rule of law in China. Of course, Mr. Schellenberg can appeal again to the Supreme Court in China.
I mean, even though drug smuggling is bad, right?
What the Supreme Court in China will do.
It was convenient.
And this most likely will have some impact with what the Canadians are doing against Madam Meng Wanzhou.
Okay, yeah, but it was convenient, right? He got 15 years and then suddenly, by the click of a finger, he's retried and he gets the death penalty at a time when the Canadians decided to adhere to the extradition request of the United States. Awfully convenient. Still think it's completely independent?
No, the reality is that there was a decision passed on to Mr. Schellenberg. He appealed, and then in the appellate course, the Chinese court found new evidences which turned Mr. Schellenberg from an accomplice to a ringleader in this drug smuggling case. And his liability was increased because of the new evidence found in the process. And I think this is truly, according to a legal process, it's not an appellate decision. It's a retrial of Mr. Schellenberg.
Sophie Richardson.
I think nobody should doubt the validity of the evidence against Mr. Schellenberg.
So, Sophie, do you accept that argument?
You know, I find it extraordinary how willing people are to defend China's judicial system without imagining what it would be like if they or a family member were themselves enduring, the lack of access to a lawyer, more than a year held without being charged. You know, do people then really actually feel it's a fair trial? I think that's sort of a peculiar disconnect. And let's be very clear. You know, the Chinese judicial system explicitly states itself that it exists to serve the interests of the Chinese Communist Party. And so in that sense, it's been very easy for an organization like mine over the years to document the ways in which political interests have dictated legal outcomes. And I think what's happened to Mr. Schellenberg falls squarely in that frame of analysis.
Back to the big picture realpolitik, Lynette Ong, is the difficult aspect of this for Canada the fact that it needs China more than China needs it on multiple levels? And is that why Trudeau needs to tread carefully, perhaps?
Definitely. I think traditionally we have been very close allies of the United States, and Canada and China is also Canada's second trading partner. So we really couldn't afford to offend any party. And if China has a problem with U.S., I think it should really rightly take up the issue with the United States. I think putting pressure on Canada really wouldn't help with resolving the issue. Really wouldn't help with the release of Meng Wanzhou, because once Meng Wanzhou is in the custody of the Canadian court, the Canadian government cannot actually intervene in the court decision because of separation of powers in this country.
Victor Gao, pick on someone your own size. Meng Wanzhou is wanted by the United States. Canada's merely responding to an extradition appeal. If you want to fight with someone, fight with America.
First of all, who arrested Meng Wanzhou? Who holds Meng Wanzhou right now?
That's how it works.
Which jurisdiction
that's
is
how the
Meng
extradition. That's how
Wanzhou right now.
But that's how the extradition treaty works.
Wake up to the reality. Don't fool around. Don't beat it up about the bush. Wake up to the reality that Canada held Meng Wanzhou. That's the reality, and you need to bark at the right tree. Bark at your own tree. Don't bark at the death sentence for Mr. Schellenberg. He is sentenced to death, and there is an appeals process leading all the way to the Supreme Court of China, and we can work with that process. Of course, I'm a registered attorney, and I need to advise my clients to do the right thing according to the right legal process. But between China and Canada, the real thing that's really at stake is Madam Meng Wanzhou. Don't fool around. Let's face the reality. Prime Minister Trudeau, you need to face up to the reality.
Can I just intercept here? I think if the purpose of the Chinese authority is to push Huawei up to be a global international player, which, 7 weeks ago, many people in this country actually believe that Huawei is the lead player in providing 5G network. But 7 weeks later, given the, can we say, increasing belligerent behavior of the Chinese authorities, it is really not helping Huawei or any of the multinational companies of China out there. It's the global ambassadors. And I think global companies of China are actually suffering because of the behavior of the Chinese authorities. They are actually paying a price for how the government actually behaves.
Okay, well, testing times for Canada and China. Listen, Victor Gao, Sophie Richardson, and Lynette Ong, the story is not going to go away anytime soon. And we look forward to having you back on the Newsmakers. But for now, I'm out of time. So thank you very much for joining us.
The Me Too movement against sexual harassment.
Is this the best a man can get? Instead of excuses, we need to make change.
Gillette is under fire from both critics and supporters of the Me Too movement for an ad seemingly aimed at promoting better behavior among men. Critics say the minute-and-a-half film vilifies all men as chauvinists. Others argue that Gillette's parent company is trying to monetize the Me Too movement. They also point out that Procter & Gamble spends advertising dollars on Fox News, which has been the target of multiple sexual harassment lawsuits. Well, let's discuss the ad now with our guests in London now. James Miller is a political commentator and author of Dads Don't Babysit, and Michael Buchanan is the leader of the UK's anti-feminist political party, Justice for Men and Boys. Gentlemen, pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Let me start with you, Michael Buchanan. What's your problem with the Gillette ad?
My problem is it's a very naked attack on men as a class. Gillette, of course, also have the shaving brand Venus for women. Now, if Gillette produced an ad telling women that they should stop their toxic femininity, they should stop violently attacking their partners, they should stop paternity fraud, and they should stop killing their unborn children in their tens of millions, I think there'd be a bit of a storm, don't you?
Well, I don't really, because that's a hypothetical. Let's focus on the ad as it is right now. It's saying don't bully, don't sexually harass. What's the problem with that?
It's not. What the problem is it's saying that men, that a very small proportion of, well, it's making out that far more men exhibit bad behavior than they do. The same radical feminist director who made this has also made pieces in which she almost deifies women, makes them into goddesses. But here we have men just treated appallingly. And it's also racist, might I say.
How is it racist?
Almost all the good men in the piece are black, and almost all the bad men are white. And that again is a long-standing feminist narrative, that not only are men evil, but white men are particularly evil.
Okay, James Miller, this type of disapproval has been rampant online, and we saw a lot of men get really angry at the Gillette ad, and they want to boycott Gillette and so on. Tell me why you were having a little chuckle to yourself when you heard Michael's misgivings.
Well, I mean, I don't know where to begin, really. I mean, the director made a film, an advert called This Girl Can, encouraging women to get into sport. 3 million more women took up sport. I can't see how that is possibly a bad thing. Yeah, if Gillette is wrong, they're going to go bust, aren't they? I mean, that's the bottom line. We've had the men's rights activists, this is like a week on, and they're still been triggered by this. It's a razor advert, for goodness sake. And if it's so out of touch with men, then they're going to go bust. End off, because it's mainly men that use razors. I mean, admittedly, neither of your guests obviously are customers of Gillette, but that's the bottom line. But Gillette aren't going to go bust, are they? Because in fact, they are tapping into a much wider movement, a much wider feeling that men need to change what it means to be masculine.
Right.
They need to be better. And that's what the advert is about. And most men agree with that.
Right. Yeah, and it's interesting. Good point that you made. The only person reaching out for a Mach 3 this morning was, in fact, the host of the program. Michael Buchanan, be better. Why not point out that there are certain terrible things happening out there in society, and this shines a little light on it. Even if Gillette's intentions are not altogether altruistic, they just want to make a buck, so what? It's advertising, and the message is something that you can't disagree with.
The message is something I can disagree with, and I go back to the double standard. Nobody, least of all Gillette, are saying to women, be better. No one is saying stop committing paternity fraud. Stop violently attacking your partners. Stop killing unborn children in their tens of millions.
Right.
Gillette are not saying that. This is uniquely men and boys who are regarded as evil.
Let me then ask you, Michael, if you feel this is part of a broader conspiracy of sorts culturally against men, because that's what your movement stands for. Help me understand why you see this as something bigger.
Oh, it's very much something bigger. I mean, it's part of the radical feminist project to shame men in order to pave the way for them to be ever more privileged. In our last election, general election manifesto, we covered 20 areas where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state's actions and inactions, almost always to privilege women and girls. There is not one area in Britain today where the state specifically assaults the human rights of women and girls. Not one. So feminists are not fighting for gender equality. That's the big lie. They're fighting for ever more privilege.
Okay, so James, this is being pushed by radical feminists who want power. They don't want equality. That's the opinion on the other side. Tell me why you disagree with that.
Well, the radical feminists have been trying that for a long time, and they're clearly completely rubbish, because there is no metric by which you can suggest that women are on top. Whether you call that the number of MPs we have in Britain or in almost any parliament in the world. I think Rwanda is particularly equal, but they really stand out. Everywhere else, we have more lawmakers than more male lawmakers than female lawmakers, whether it's company boards, whether it's pay, again, there's a gender pay gap. On any metric, men are winning. Now, that is based on history, that's based on all sorts of things, and it's time for it to change. We've moved on. Surely we can change it. And that's where the Gillette ad comes in. Can I just come back to, you said, so what about the advert? It's actually really important that men see different role models, that they see that it's okay to be different. So it actually really matters. As you say, Gillette may be just about making money, but by putting this ad out there, they give men the opportunity to go, yeah, actually, it's okay to challenge sexism. It's normal. That's all right, for example. And that's really important because it's up to men to change it. As I say, men have the power, but that also gives us the power to change things.
Right.
And that's where this advert is really important.
So, James, just for the record, do you consider yourself oppressed in any way as a man, or do you consider yourself privileged? James?
I'm certainly privileged. I'm certainly not oppressed. There are constrictions on who I am and what I can be. Society says men should be a certain way, and we absolutely need to challenge that. And that is where the ad comes in. And there's certainly gender stereotypes are bad for women and they're bad for men. It's not a competition. It's not like if one is up or the other is down. That's the trouble with men's rights activists. They think that if women have more rights, somehow men have to have fewer rights. It's not a zero-sum game. We all gain.
Okay. So, Michael, I as well do not consider myself oppressed in any way, shape, or form. I consider myself very privileged. Do you consider yourself oppressed as a man, Michael?
This isn't about me, this is not about you, and this is not about James. This is about a movement, an ideology, feminism, which is all about privileging women ever more.
Has it taken anything away from you, is my question. Has it taken anything away from you?
This is not about me. And again,
who's it about?
You know, I make the point, it's about men as a class and about women as a class. And I go back to the point that there are 20 areas in Britain today where the human rights of men and boys are assaulted by the state, and not one where the human rights of women and girls are assaulted by the state. Not one. So men are very clearly disadvantaged by the state, although men pay 3/4 of the income tax, which fund the state. Men are financing their own muggers.
I want to tell you something interesting, Michael, because clearly when these guys look at the zeitgeist, right, they try and tap into, when the advertising agency and all the marketing heads within a major company like Gillette or Nike with Kaepernick and so on, they try and tap into the zeitgeist. They try and tap into what's very mainstream, if you like. And so when Pankaj Bala, who is the Gillette brand director, said, we weren't trying to court controversy, we were just trying to upgrade the selling line that we've held for 30 years, the best a man can get and make it relevant. I don't think our intention was to have controversy just for the sake of controversy. What's interesting, it's going to annoy the radical feminists when he says that, Michael, because he's saying we're not even trying to change anything, we're just reflecting what's out there in society. So isn't the truth, Michael, that society has moved on and you're stuck in the dark ages?
On the contrary, we're the people who are telling the truth. I mean, this nonsense about toxic masculinity. I mean, you know, traditional masculinity is a very fine thing, and we need more of it, not less.
Such as how? Okay. Oh, just before you come in, James, what type of traditional masculinity do we need more of?
I think qualities like stoicism, protecting the vulnerable, and that's a very big difference between men's rights activists like me and feminists. We want to protect the weak and vulnerable, whereas feminists glory in the slaughter of unborn children.
Okay, you brought up abortion a lot here, and that's almost a separate debate here, right? So you brought it up 3 times. I just want to note that, you know, it's an issue for you, and perhaps when we have an abortion debate, we'll bring you on next time. But James Miller, round us off here as we finish up the discussion.
I just have to, the idea of traditional masculinity, in the last couple of weeks, we've had a report from the American Psychological Association, which says traditional masculinity is bad for men, that it causes, it increases poor mental health amongst men, it can lead to suicide, lead to dangerous risk-taking, and that is to do with a lack of willing to sort of show emotion and show weakness and all the rest of it. I just don't understand why these men's rights activists think they know better than the American Psychological Association. These are, you know, serious scientists, and they say
I'd be very happy to tell you.
Is bad.
Okay. Okay. Well. Okay. Okay, Michael. I'm going to ask for an extra minute. Okay. Go ahead. So, Michael, have a little bite, and then James will respond at the end. Michael.
We did a piece on the absurd report from the American Psychological Association recently. The organization, a bit like James's magazine, The New Statesman, has been absolutely taken over by radical feminists. So the only narratives that will come out of the APA will be feminist narratives.
So there's a scientific report, and your response is you wrote a report and it's been taken over by feminists. That's clearly not. You're not got equal arguments, have you? There, you've got a massive scientific a serious report and you saying, "Oh, they've been taken over by
It's not a
feminists."
serious.
That's
It's
not a response.
it's not a
is it?
serious
Come on.
report.
Listen.
It is.
Okay, fair enough.
It is not a serious report. It is feminist propaganda.
Okay,
Nothing less.
so one of you believes it's feminist propaganda. The other believes this is, proper science that's been conducted by verified scientists. Gentlemen, I have to move on, and I just want to put this out there for the sake of clarity. We reached out to Gillette. We would have loved to have had them on the program to discuss their thinking and why they did it. They declined to give us the interview, unfortunately. But James and Michael, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
El comunicado del presidente Moreno instigó una espiral de violencia xenófoba contra la comunidad migrante venezolana en el Ecuador.
That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, a pipeline explosion kills more than 90 people in Mexico. We debate why some say the president is partly to blame. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.